August 1945. The war had just ended, but for dozens of Japanese women captured in the Pacific, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like silence after a storm. They stood behind barbed wire in a dusty American-run camp on the Philippine coast, eyes sunken from hunger and disbelief. For weeks, rumors had filled the compound that Allied soldiers would humiliate them, punish them for Japan's crimes, make examples of them before sending them away. When the guards approached that morning, the women braced themselves. Boots crushed the gravel. Orders were brief. Then came something none of them expected. Metal trays, silver spoons, and a line of American soldiers quietly handing out food. Steam rose from rice, canned fruit, and something cold, sweet, soft, and white. Ice cream. A taste none of them had seen in years. Many froze, thinking it was a trick. Some reached out, trembling. One woman whispered, "It's kindness." Another began to cry. The camp, built for enemies, fell silent under the sound of spoons touching tin. The women had come from shattered corners of an empire that no longer existed. Some were former nurses from military hospitals in Manila and Bataan. Others clerks, radio operators, and civilian volunteers caught in the collapse of Japan's Pacific defense. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the Pacific was an ocean of ruins. The American occupation forces faced an impossible task, caring for thousands of enemy prisoners, many of them wounded, malnourished, or displaced. But among them, Japanese women stood apart. They were few in number, and their presence inside prisoner-of-war compounds challenged the very expectations both sides held of war and mercy. Most of these women had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death. Japanese military codes, reinforced since the Russo-Japanese War, insisted that surrender was shameful. Even medics. Allied civilian auxiliaries were expected to die with their posts, yet the Pacific War had turned that idea into a grim impossibility. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, mass suicides had already shown the depth of this indoctrination. But when the guns fell silent, surrender was no longer a matter of choice. American patrols found women hiding in bomb shelters, some clutching photos of families, others too weak to walk. The U.S. military's policy toward Japanese prisoners evolved rapidly in those months. Early in the war, Pacific captivity had been rare. Japanese soldiers seldom surrendered. But by mid-1945, Allied forces were capturing them in the thousands. Prisoner camps were hastily expanded in the Philippines, Guam, Okinawa, and Hawaii, each following the Geneva Convention's framework for humane treatment. American command understood that Japan's future cooperation would depend on demonstrating fairness, even toward those once called fanatics. Female prisoners, however, required separate quarters, female guards, and basic medical care, challenges in a system designed for men. In one camp outside Manila, the U.S. 8th Army set aside a small compound for about 50 Japanese women captured during the Luzon campaign. Most had served as Army nurses under the Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Area Army, commanded by General Yamashita. When Yamashita surrendered in September, his scattered forces included remnants of field hospitals and communications units. The women were escorted under guard, not in chains, but in exhausted silence. Their uniforms were torn, their hair cut short, their shoes mostly gone. American records described them as cooperative but fearful, unfamiliar with English, and deeply anxious about their fate. Life inside the camp was harsh but orderly. Barbed wire fences surrounded barracks built of timber and corrugated metal. The humid air carried the smell of disinfectant, latrines, and burnt wood. Food was plain, rice, beans, powdered eggs, yet it was more than many Japanese civilians were receiving back home. Still, the women expected humiliation. Propaganda during the war had portrayed Americans as brutal conquerors, a lie repeated so often that it became truth in their minds. When they first saw African-American cooks among the U.S. Army's service units, some of the women recoiled, never having seen a black person before. Their fear was not hatred, but confusion, the collision of isolation and indoctrination meeting the reality of humanity. The American camp officers knew they were being watched, not just by their superiors, but by history itself. Reports on POW conditions were reviewed by both the Red Cross and the press. Commanders wanted no scandal. To them, the treatment of these Japanese women was an opportunity to show the difference between democratic values and the ideology that had fueled Japan's war. A medical officer later wrote in his diary that the women expected the whip, not the spoon. He described how the first week passed in uneasy quiet, the women refusing to speak, bowing deeply whenever addressed, their eyes always downcast. Gradually, routine replaced fear. They were given soap, blankets, and even typewriters to record inventory lists. Some volunteered to help clean the infirmary or assist American nurses treating wounded prisoners. Each small act softened the distance between guard and captive. And yet, beneath this fragile normalcy, the psychological divide remained, a wall built from years of propaganda, fear, and sham. It would take something small, something ordinary to begin breaking it. That moment would come not from orders, but from compassion carried in a metal container, chilled against the tropical heat. The women didn't know it yet, but the next morning would bring the gesture that made them weep. A serving of ice cream that would challenge everything they'd been taught about enemies and honor. The American-run camps in the Philippines reflected the changing face of the Pacific War's end. By September 1945, the United States faced the enormous responsibility of processing more than 500,000 Japanese soldiers scattered across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. But women among them were rare, less than 1% of all prisoners. Their treatment became a quiet test of the victor's humanity, especially in a war that had been fought with such bitterness. The Manila Women's Camp stood as a small but significant example of that transition, from hatred to uneasy coexistence. The camp's commandant, a major from the U.S. Army's Military Police Corps, followed the letter of the Geneva Convention. He understood that the prisoners were not criminals but captured personnel. Still, many of his own men had fought in Bataan and Leyte, had lost friends to Japanese fire, and found it hard to separate duty from memory. To them, showing kindness to the enemy was not instinctive, it had to be learned. But the Army's leadership was clear. There would be no revenge, no humiliation, no retaliation. America's moral strength, they said, would be measured not in victory parades but in restraint. Among the Japanese women were nurses who had treated soldiers from both sides. Some carried notebooks filled with medical records. Others had seen horrors beyond imagination, amputations without anesthesia, starvation, executions for desertion. A few had even risked their own lives to save wounded Americans captured during the campaigns. But none of that erased the shame they felt for being prisoners. They often washed their uniforms by hand, scrubbing until their skin bled, as if cleansing their dishonor. At night, many prayed silently, whispering into their thin blankets, unsure if their families even knew they were alive. American camp personnel noticed their discipline. Meals were served 3 times a day. The women would form perfect lines, bow before eating, and never waste a single grain of rice. They cleaned their quarters meticulously, folding their clothes with military precision. To the Americans, this display of order and modesty was both admirable and unsettling, a reminder that these were not ordinary prisoners, but people molded by an entirely different code. The contrast fascinated the American staff. Some soldiers quietly wondered how a nation capable of such dignity could also wage such a brutal war. Outside the camp, Manila was still scarred from one of the war's most devastating battles. Entire districts lay in ashes. Civilians struggled to rebuild under military administration. Food shortages persisted. Yet inside the camp fence, order prevailed, a fragile microcosm of discipline amid ruin. Letters from Red Cross inspectors described the women as courteous, obedient, and fearful of misunderstanding. They avoided eye contact, never raised their voices, and rarely smiled. It wasn't hostility, it was a lingering shadow of propaganda that had told them Americans were monsters. The smallest act of normalcy, a smile, a greeting, was received with disbelief. Then came the policy that changed everything. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps, which supplied the camps, had begun distributing surplus rations. Among them were frozen goods stored for soldiers during the final campaigns: milk powder, sugar, and ice cream mix. For the Americans, it was routine comfort food, a symbol of home. For the Japanese women, it was unimaginable luxury. In Japan, wartime rationing had wiped out sugar, milk, and eggs years earlier. Many hadn't tasted sweetness since the late 1930s. When the U.S. cooks decided to serve ice cream to all camp occupants as part of a morale program, no one thought much of it, except the women who received it. That gesture, unplanned, procedural, almost bureaucratic, became a moment of quiet revelation. For the American soldiers distributing it, it was just another day's duty, a routine act of service. For the women behind the wire, it was something entirely different. It was proof that mercy could exist even between enemies. The serving spoon became a bridge between two worlds, one defeated, one victorious, both human. By the time the trays were cleared, the camp atmosphere had changed. Some guards noticed prisoners smiling for the first time. A nurse offered a small bow to an American sergeant who didn't know what to do except nod awkwardly in return. For a brief moment, war's divisions dissolved into something unspoken, the recognition of shared suffering. That memory would remain carried quietly by those who lived it, never recorded in grand reports but whispered decades later by women who remembered not the fences or the hunger, but the ice cream that made them weep. The story of the ice cream reached beyond a single act of kindness. It revealed something deeper about the psychology of war and the way people confront humanity after years of indoctrination. Each perspective inside that camp, American and Japanese, carried its own weight of memory, duty, and shame. In a world that had just witnessed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the smallest gestures of decency began to carry the meaning that treaties could not. For the Japanese women, the emotional fracture ran deep. Raised under the wartime code of Yamato Nadeshiko, the ideal of pure, obedient womanhood, they had been told that loyalty to the emperor outweighed life itself. Propaganda leaflets, school lessons, and military briefings repeated one phrase: never be captured alive. The shame of surrender meant their names would be erased, their families dishonored, and their spirits unworthy of remembrance. In that moral universe, capture was not survival, it was disgrace. Yet when they stood behind the barbed wire of an American camp and were offered ice cream, they realized the world outside Japan was not built on vengeance. It was built on something that defied the logic of their training: compassion from an enemy. For many of them, it was their first direct contact with Americans. In Japanese wartime propaganda, Americans had been portrayed as demons, crude, cruel, monstrous. Pamphlets distributed in hospitals showed illustrations of Allied troops mutilating prisoners or desecrating shrines. Even civilian volunteers had been warned that if captured, they would face torture or assault. That image crumbled the moment they saw a young American private clumsily handing them dessert with a nervous smile. One nurse later recalled in an oral history recorded decades after the war, "I had feared the enemy more than death itself, but they treated us as people. I could not stop crying." On the American side, the scene carried a different tension. These were men who had fought in the Pacific, many fresh from the horrors of Iwo Jima, Leyte, or Okinawa. They had seen kamikaze pilots plunge into ships, had found bodies of their friends on black volcanic beaches. The propaganda they'd been fed was equally absolute. The Japanese would never surrender, and kindness was weakness. Yet now they were face to face with women, not soldiers, not threats, but humans who bowed politely, whose hands trembled from hunger, whose eyes carried the same exhaustion their own did. The act of serving them food forced many Americans to confront something uncomfortable, that their enemies were not monsters, just people who had been trapped in another nation's idea of duty. Among the cooks in the camp kitchen was a corporal from Texas who had fought on Luzon before being reassigned to logistics. He had once watched Japanese snipers kill his platoon sergeant, yet as he scooped out the melting ice cream that day, he couldn't bring himself to feel hatred. "They looked like ghosts," he later told a Red Cross inspector. "If I were in their place, I'd want someone to feed me too." His words captured the quiet transformation happening across the Pacific at that time. America's strength was shifting from destruction to reconstruction, from dominance to dignity. The ice cream moment was a symbol of that transition, a gesture that proved victory didn't have to mean cruelty. There was also the cultural angle, the collision of two civilizations separated not only by language but by philosophy. The Japanese women, schooled in self-denial, viewed comfort as indulgence. Sweetness in their wartime rationing had been erased. Sugar was a luxury reserved for high officers or the sick. Ice cream to them was foreign, a frivolous Western pleasure. Yet that very sweetness became the language through which they understood that mercy could exist even after defeat. When they tasted it, it wasn't just the cold sugar they felt. It was the shock of realizing that their captors saw them as human. For the American officers, this moment served a larger political purpose. The U.S. military understood that how they treated Japanese prisoners would shape Japan's perception of the occupation. Reports from Washington emphasized that humane conduct could become a psychological weapon more powerful than bombs, a living contrast to Japan's own treatment of Allied POWs, many of whom had suffered starvation and brutality. By showing decency, the Americans hoped to break the ideological hold of Japanese militarism. But the soldiers on the ground weren't thinking of policy. They were thinking of the faces in front of them and the way those faces changed when they saw kindness. A psychological officer later described it in his notes. The prisoners displayed expressions of disbelief and relief simultaneously. The event carried no military importance, yet it dissolved hostility in a way propaganda never could. That sentence, written in fading ink, captured something timeless, that the moral reconstruction of a nation often begins in moments too small for history books to notice. Even within the camp's routine, the ice cream day became a quiet legend. The women would later recall it among themselves in whispers, not as indulgence but as revelation. Some said it was the first time they felt forgiven by the universe. Others simply said it was the day they realized they had survived. For the U.S. military, compassion was not only an act of conscience, it was strategy. The Pacific War had ended not just with Japan's surrender, but with America's sudden responsibility for reshaping the image of democracy in the East. In the ruins of empires, every humane act became a quiet broadcast of values. Feeding enemies, offering medical care, and rebuilding villages were deliberate gestures meant to show that America's victory carried restraint. The ice cream at the POW camp, though unplanned, fit that emerging philosophy perfectly. It turned policy into something tangible, a spoonful of proof that the war's victors could also be caretakers. The psychological angle was equally profound. Many American officers noted how quickly emotional barriers softened after that day. The women who once avoided eye contact began acknowledging guards asking for English words to describe utensils or food. The camp doctor reported that general morale improved. Even laughter, he wrote, was heard for the first time. For prisoners who had expected execution, such gestures were more powerful than formal speeches. The women began writing in journals again, recording daily temperatures, food lists, and prayers, small acts of reclaiming life. They had been taught to suppress emotion, yet here, survival itself became an act of quiet courage. To the American psychologists embedded in the occupation effort, these transformations were critical. Japan's defeat had not only broken its military power, but also its moral foundation. To rebuild it, the U.S. needed to model humanity, not dominance. Every camp meal, every gesture of fairness was part of the process. Some officers even documented the effects of kindness as cultural therapy, observing how Japanese captives slowly redefined what honor and surrender meant. In a sense, that ice cream became a metaphor for America's broader Reconstruction approach, winning peace by demonstrating that compassion could exist without weakness. On a human level, the gesture revealed something even simpler. Many of the American soldiers serving in the camp were young, 19 or 20 years old, far from home, unfamiliar with foreign cultures, and tired of war. They missed their own families, the comfort of routine, and the sweetness of normal life. To them, giving ice cream to prisoners was not grand strategy, but a way to feel human again. One sergeant from Illinois, interviewed years later, said, "It reminded me of my sisters back home. They were about the same age as some of those women. I couldn't hate them anymore after that." That kind of empathy was rare in wartime, yet it became more common as the U.S. occupation deepened. Across the Pacific, similar stories appeared, of soldiers sharing cigarettes with surrendered Japanese troops, of medics treating wounded enemies without hesitation, of translators helping families find missing relatives. Each act chipped away at the myth of inhumanity that war had built. But in the women's camp, where dignity had once been stripped away, the impact was especially personal. The ice creams. Wasn't just food, it was acknowledgement, the restoration of identity to those who had believed themselves erased. The moral angle was perhaps the most striking. The war had exposed humanity's capacity for cruelty. The Bataan Death March, Nanjing, the atomic bombings, the firestorms of Tokyo. Both sides had witnessed horror on scales unimaginable. In that landscape, forgiveness seemed impossible. Yet within the narrow confines of a tropical prison camp, the moral question shifted from collective guilt to individual grace. Could a single act of kindness redeem the face of an entire enemy? The women's tears suggested it could. The Americans didn't intend to symbolize redemption, they simply acted on instinct. But in doing so, they proved that mercy could coexist with justice. The symbolic angle extended far beyond the wire. American journalists who visited the camp described it as a model of humane order. Red Cross officers noted that the women's conditions were improving, that cooperation between captors and captives was exemplary. These reports circulated quietly among Allied governments, contrasting sharply with the brutal treatment Allied POWs had suffered in Japanese hands. Though rarely publicized, such accounts became internal reminders of why the United States insisted on humane conduct, not for image, but for moral continuity. The world, exhausted by war, needed examples that compassion could still survive amid ashes. For the Japanese women themselves, the experience reshaped identity in ways that would echo for decades. When they were eventually repatriated, many struggled to speak of their captivity. In Japan, surrender still carried stigma. To admit that Americans had treated them kindly was to challenge an entire cultural narrative. Yet some did. In post-war interviews conducted by Japanese historians in the 1970s, several women recounted the ice cream day as a turning point, not of politics, but of perspective. One nurse said, "It was not the sweetness that made me cry. It was realizing that the people I feared most were capable of gentleness." This realization carried quiet power. In their memories, the moment transcended nationality and rank. It became a private symbol of reconciliation before the word itself existed in treaties. The camp's routine continued for months: roll calls, rations, letters censored by officers. But the emotional distance between captor and captive never fully returned to what it had been before that morning. Something irreversible had shifted. The prisoners began to see humanity where propaganda had shown only hate, and the Americans began to see remorse where they expected defiance. When the camp gates finally opened for repatriation, the women left in silence, carrying only what little they owned. But in their hearts, they carried something intangible, the lesson that compassion could pierce even the armor of indoctrination. The ice cream was gone, melted long ago in the tropical heat, but its memory endured as a quiet rebellion against everything war had taught them to believe. The morning began like every other, humid, heavy, and still. A pale mist rolled in from the bay, settling over the wire fences like breath on glass. At dawn, a bugle sounded, thin and metallic, echoing across the camp's gravel paths. The women rose mechanically from their our bunks, folding blankets, washing faces in cold basins, preparing for inspection. No one expected change. Routine had become survival. Inside the small mess hut, the air smelled of diesel and powdered milk. American cooks were working through their rations list: canned peaches, rice, flour, and something rarely unpacked: frozen tins labeled U.S. Army ice cream mix. The order had come through logistics to clear stock before it spoiled in the heat. For the soldiers, it was a trivial task. For the prisoners who would receive it, the act was about to fracture years of fear. By mid-morning, the temperature had risen past 90 degrees. The women lined up for their daily meal, standing barefoot on the packed soil. American guards watched silently, rifles slung low, their faces expressionless. Then came the first sign of confusion. The cooks began wheeling out large aluminum tubs, each set in crushed ice. Steam hissed from dry ice packed around them. A faint scent of vanilla drifted through the humid air, an impossible smell in a place of punishment. When the first spoonful dropped onto a tin tray, the women hesitated. White, soft, cold. Many thought it was soap or medicine. They looked at one another, whispering in disbelief. The guards gestured, "Eat." No one moved. Finally, one of the nurses, gaunt and pale, lifted her spoon. The instant the ice cream touched her lips, her face froze, not in fear but in confusion. Then her shoulders trembled. Tears began to form before she could swallow. Around her, the others followed, tasting carefully, as if defying a trap. Within seconds, sobs broke out quietly along the line. Witnesses described the moment as eerie. The camp fell silent except for the clinking of metal spoons and the low hum of the generator. Even the guards stopped talking. One American private, only 19, later said he felt something inside him unravel. He had never seen the enemy cry before, certainly not like this. It wasn't joy, he wrote in a letter home. It was something deeper, like they'd remembered they were alive. The turning point was invisible on any map, yet it was real in every heart present. For months, suspicion had governed every glance, every word exchanged between captor and captive. But that morning, the atmosphere shifted. The women no longer stood as defeated soldiers, but as human beings capable of emotion. The guards, hardened by years of propaganda, suddenly saw fragility where they had expected defiance. The spoon, not the rifle, had become the instrument of change. The camp's commanding officer observed the scene from his office window. He was a career soldier, pragmatic, unsentimental, but even he paused. "If you can make your enemy weep with kindness," he later remarked to a reporter, "You've already won the harder war." His words were never printed. They remained in a field diary later archived by the U.S. Army Historical Division. Yet the sentiment echoed through the ranks, quiet proof that empathy could achieve what violence could not. The Japanese women's tears were not merely gratitude, they were release. For years they had lived under a system that demanded silence and endurance. Now, in the unlikeliest of places, that silence cracked. Crying was not weakness, it was liberation. The ice cream was sweet, yes, but it tasted of contradiction, of defeat mixed with mercy, of pride melting into humility. One survivor later said it was "they know us," and first time she had believed in a future after war. "We thought the Americans would kill us," she recalled. "Instead, they gave us sugar." The American guards did not know what to do with that emotion. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others offered second helpings without speaking. A few quietly removed their helmets, as though standing at a funeral. For them, the moment stripped away the uniform's armor. They were no longer conquerors. They were witnesses to reconciliation neither side had sought yet both needed. By noon, the sun had turned the sky white. Melted ice cream pooled in trays, mixing with rice and fruit. The women ate slowly, reverently. The youngest among them, barely 18, smiled for the first time since capture. A photographer from a Red Cross unit stationed nearby captured the aftermath on film. Japanese women seated cross-legged under palm frond shade, holding spoons, faces wet with tears. The photo would never be published, but decades later, historians identified it in a private archive in Illinois, labeled simply POW Camp, Manila, 1945. That image became the silent testimony of the war's most unexpected moment of grace. No speeches, no ceremony, only quiet humanity, recorded in black and white, preserved by chance. The day ended as it began, with the evening roll call and the fading sound of insects in the grass. Yet nothing felt the same. The camp no longer seemed like a place of punishment, but of endurance shared. The war was over, but on that small patch of earth, peace had begun, one spoonful at a time. That afternoon, the camp seemed different. The same fences stood, the same guards watched the same gates, yet something invisible had shifted between the two sides. The women, who had once moved through the compound like shadows, began to linger outside their barracks after meals. Some even began tending to a small patch of earth near the laundry line, scraping the dry soil with spoons and sticks, planting scraps of beans from the kitchen. It was a fragile gesture, almost childlike, but it marked a return to life. For the first time, laughter was heard, faint, uncertain, but real. American guards noticed the change. The hostility that had once defined every encounter gave way to curiosity. Soldiers began greeting the women with nods instead of orders. A few learned to say good morning in broken Japanese. The women replied softly, bowing each time. They still feared punishment for mistakes, but it never came. The ice cream had done what authority and policy could not. It had dismantled the invisible wall of fear. The camp doctor, Captain Robert Whitaker, noted the transformation in his medical log. He wrote that several prisoners who had shown signs of depression began eating regularly and sleeping better. The emotional shock of kindness, he observed, has done more for their health than any medicine I could prescribe. It was an insight shared by many across post-war Asia, that compassion, once withheld, could heal faster than discipline. The camp's morale improved on both sides. Guards volunteered for longer shifts. The women began helping in the infirmary again, folding gauze and assisting with inventory. The distance between captor and captive quietly blurred into cooperation. Outside the wire, the Philippines was still reeling. Manila remained a ruin of smoke-stained buildings and orphaned children. Every port, every field, still bore scars of occupation. American journalists occasionally visited the POW camps, curious to see how former enemies were treated. They were often surprised to find order, cleanliness, and, most of all, mutual respect. Reports submitted to Washington described these camps as examples of humane reconstruction, though the ice cream story itself remained untold, too ordinary perhaps for print, yet too profound to fade from memory. Inside the camp, word spread quickly among the women. They began calling it Amano High, the day of sweetness. It became a phrase whispered before sleep, a reminder that they had lived through something rare. Mercy from the hands of those they had been told would destroy them. For many, it was the first time they questioned the absolutes taught by imperial propaganda. Could the enemy, they wondered, be capable of such gentleness? And if so, what did that say about everything they had believed? One of the prisoners, a nurse named Shizuko, later wrote about that day in a post-war memoir published privately in Tokyo. "It melted more than the ice," she wrote. "It melted the hate I had carried." Her words captured what no report or military log could. The sweetness was not in the taste, but in the realization that kindness could exist without agenda. For her, that single act had changed what victory and defeat meant. She no longer saw herself as dishonored, only as human again. The American officers understood its power too. When command circulated reports on prisoner morale, the Manila camp stood out for its discipline and cooperation. Colonel Edwin Boone, who oversaw the regional POW system, praised the staff for upholding the American standard of conduct. He knew these gestures would echo beyond the fences, into the broader occupation of Japan, where winning hearts would soon matter as much as controlling territory. What happened in that small camp was, in miniature, what America hoped to achieve across the Pacific, to end the war not just by force, but by moral example. But there was one more layer to this moment, the historical irony. Only months earlier, many of these same women had worked in field hospitals treating soldiers who believed Americans were beasts. Some had even prepared syringes for wounded men who cursed the enemy with their dying breath. Now those same hands held spoons instead of instruments of war. The same nurses who once swore loyalty to the emperor were quietly thanking their captors for a meal. It was not surrender. It was something deeper, something the manuals never taught. Reconciliation born not of words, but of behavior. As dusk fell that day, the camp loudspeaker played a radio broadcast from Manila. President Truman's speech about peace and reconstruction crackled faintly through static. Few understood the English words, but the tone was calm, almost fatherly. The women listened, seated along the barracks wall, their faces illuminated by the last orange light. To them, the meaning was not in the words, but in the silence that followed. The war was over, truly over, and they, who had expected nothing but punishment, had tasted mercy instead. When night came, the women lay awake, whispering softly. Some spoke of home, others recited prayers of gratitude. In a corner bunk, Shizuko wrote the date in her notebook. September 3rd, 1945. The day Americans gave us ice cream. The ink faded with time, but the meaning endured. A record of an ordinary miracle. Beyond the wire, crickets sang, and the guards walked their rounds under dim yellow lamps. The camp had not changed in structure, yet it had become something else entirely. Not a prison, but a fragile space where the first seeds of forgiveness had begun to grow. Weeks passed, and the war that had shattered the Pacific slowly receded into history. Yet inside the camp, its echoes lingered in the quietest ways, in the sound of women sweeping the dirt paths, in the smell of disinfectant drifting from the infirmary, in the distant hum of airplanes carrying occupation officers toward Japan. The women no longer flinched at those sounds. Each day they ate, worked, and waited. The fences still stood, but fear no longer lived within them. American command reports recorded the Manila compound as exemplary. Inspectors from the Red Cross described it as a facility where dignity has been maintained. They noted that the female prisoners showed remarkable cleanliness and discipline. Their posture had changed. They no longer walked with eyes to the ground. To the Americans, it was proof that humane treatment bred order more effectively than intimidation ever could. One report even cited uncommon morale among Japanese female internees, a phrase so rare it drew notice in Washington's post-war briefings. For the guards, the women became more than anonymous detainees. They were nurses, clerks, secretaries, fragments of a defeated empire that now seemed less alien with every passing day. The ice cream moment became part of camp folklore, retold quietly among the soldiers. Some joked about it, others spoke of it with a kind of reverence. To those who had fought through the bloodiest battles of the Pacific, it symbolized something they had almost forgotten: gentleness. Outside the wire, new orders arrived daily. The U.S. military was shifting from combat to reconstruction. Engineers built hospitals, supply officers distributed food, and ships began carrying Japanese prisoners home. But among the last to be repatriated were the women. Their processing required verification of status, civilian or auxiliary, and coordination with the Allied authorities in Tokyo. Bureaucracy delayed mercy. Yet even in waiting, the women found a rhythm. They stitched bandages, wrote English words in notebooks, and sang softly at dusk, melodies of old Japanese folk songs that drifted over the camp fences like a ghost of peace. Captain Whitaker, the camp's physician, requested that several of the women assist permanently in the medical station. They understand order, hygiene, and care, he wrote in a letter to his superiors. His recommendation was approved. For a brief time, former enemies worked side by side, changing dressings, sorting supplies, and recording temperatures of American patients. It was an image almost impossible to imagine only months before. Japanese and American nurses sharing the same table, passing instruments hand to hand without a word of hatred between them. Photographs taken in late October show the camp's interior in full order. Rows of cots, women in plain work, K uniforms, American medics in khaki shirts. The mood is subdued but calm. No defiance, no humiliation, only the stillness of people learning to exist after catastrophe. In the background, a chalkboard lists rations. Rice, 50 palms, milk, 20 cans, sugar, 10 palms. Beneath it, faint writing reads, ice cream, 2 tins. A detail so ordinary that few would notice it, yet for those who had tasted it, that line carried the memory of transformation. When news arrived in November that they would be repatriated soon, many women reacted with mixed emotions. Some longed for home. Others feared what awaited them there, the shame of captivity, the judgment of families who believed they had chosen dishonor over death. In Japan, surrender still carried stigma, but the women who left Manila carried something unseen, a quiet defiance of that old code. They had discovered another kind of honor, one not rooted in death but in survival, humility, and forgiveness. As they prepared to leave, an American sergeant handed each of them a small paper tag bearing a number and a note, for transport, Tokyo. Some kept the tags for years pressed between the pages of journals. They were the last reminders of a place where enemies had shared food, sorrow, and the first fragile peace of a new world. The convoy that carried the Japanese women away from Manila left before dawn. The trucks moved slowly through the mist, headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the humid air. American soldiers stood at the gate, saluting quietly as the prisoners passed, not as victors or captives now, but as people who had shared one small, unforgettable moment in the ruins of war. The women bowed deeply from the truck beds, hands clasped, eyes shining with gratitude and fear. No one spoke. The engines drowned out everything but memory. Their journey took them first to the port where repatriation ships waited under U.S. Navy supervision. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilians crowded the docks, the defeated empire packed into lines of silence. But the women's group from the Manila camp drew special notice. Their demeanor was calm, their uniforms pressed, their faces unguarded. An American correspondent observing the embarkation described them as disciplined yet serene, a strange dignity that comes only after understanding both sides of mercy. His report never made front-page news. The world had already turned to Nuremberg, to Hiroshima, to the birth of the atomic age. Yet in quiet corners, such stories were remembered as proof that something human had survived amid the wreckage. When the women reached Japan weeks later, they stepped into a homeland that barely resembled the one they had left. Cities were skeletal. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, nothing but ruins and dust. Millions were homeless, and food was scarce. The women expected scorn, perhaps even ostracism for having surrendered, but many families wept simply to see them alive. Their accounts of captivity confused people at first. How could Americans, portrayed as monsters, have shown kindness? Yet, as occupation forces spread across Japan, as American soldiers began distributing food and rebuilding schools, the truth of those stories became harder to deny. Among the former prisoners, some tried to return to nursing, others to quiet civilian life. A few married, raised children, and spoke of their experience again, but others could not forget. Decades later, when historians began recording oral testimonies from wartime survivors, a few of these women finally told their story. They spoke not of battles or ideology, but of that single day, the ice cream day, as a symbol of how war ends differently for each soul. It was not about the food, one said softly in a 1974 interview. It was the moment I understood that kindness is stronger than orders. In America, too, traces of the event survived in diaries and letters tucked away in attics. One corporal's notebook contained a fading photograph of the camp's gate, dated September 1945. Next to it, he had written, "They cried when we fed them ice cream. Never saw anything like it. Maybe that's what peace looks like." His children would later find the entry and donate it to a local museum, where it remained mislabeled for years as POW Distribution Manila, 1946. Only when researchers revisited the archives did they realize it captured something far rarer than logistics, the precise moment when humanity returned to a battlefield without a shot fired. As time passed, the event disappeared from official records. It had no place in textbooks or military histories. Wars are remembered through battles and treaties, not through spoons and tears. Yet for those who had lived it, the memory endured privately, an unspoken reminder that the end of war is not marked by surrender papers, but by compassion rediscovered in the most unlikely circumstances. By the late 1960s, when Japan had risen again as a prosperous nation, a few of the women gathered for a reunion in Tokyo. They were old now, their hair graying, their faces lined by decades of silence. Over tea, one of them brought out a small tin spoon she had kept all her life. Its surface was dull, edges worn smooth by time. "This," she said, smiling faintly, "was our peace treaty." The others nodded, their eyes shining in quiet understanding. There were no speeches, no flags, just the sound of rain tapping softly on the window, as if the world itself remembered that sweetness once ended a war. History often remembers wars through explosions, victories, and dates carved into stone. Yet the truest end of war is found in moments so small they escape the records. A shared meal, a word unspoken, a gesture that rebuilds trust without intention. The day Japanese women prisoners wept over ice cream in a Manila camp was one of those moments. No one planned it, no one recorded it in official communiques, yet it carried more meaning than many speeches that followed. For the Americans, it was a lesson that power could be measured not only in strength but in mercy. They had won the war through fire and steel, but they preserved their humanity through restraint. For the Japanese women, it was the day they discovered that compassion could exist even from those they were taught to hate. Between those two realizations lay the fragile thread that would later connect two nations rebuilding from ashes. Respect born not from victory, but from understanding. That single act, a spoon of melting sweetness, was more than charity. It was an unspoken declaration that even in the ruins of civilization, goodness still had a pulse. The camp, the guards, the prisoners, all became witnesses to something larger than themselves, the quiet rebirth of empathy after years of destruction. In decades to come, neither governments nor textbooks would honor that moment. It would live only in memories, in faded photographs, and in the whispered recollections of those who had once believed they would die nameless. Yet perhaps that is how peace truly survives, not in monuments, but in the gentleness of ordinary people when cruelty has already taken everything else. Somewhere, among the ashes of 1945, humanity paused and chose kindness. It did not erase the crimes of war or the pain of loss, but it reminded the survivors that mercy was still possible. And that is how wars truly end, not when weapons fall silent, but when hearts do.